issue that some capacity building strengthening programs can help with. And Iwan mentioned about government policies being perhaps not as well implemented as they could be. So those are two additional challenges that are often brought up when talking about the issues that MSMEs have to face. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more on that, and also Ralph, weigh in here on especially this market access issue, because it relates really closely to the capacity building programs that you've been running in Africa these years.
Markets are at the crux of the issue here. I think access to markets, access to technology, access to finance, all of these are critically important to the competitiveness and profitability and growth of SMEs. I think we are witnessing now, most of the people in the audience and indeed around the world, we've had 20 years of markets, global markets, regional markets. And now with this rise of instability, I think the question is, how do we make our SMEs more resilient to this question of markets? From my experience in working with SMEs in Africa, I think that there's a bias that global markets or distant markets are more preferable to local markets. And oftentimes we try to get our SMEs to go to the global north or to try to sell a product in which they oftentimes have very little understanding of the customer. They're simply producing a product to be shipped to a distant market. And I think that is a number of reasons that is attractive, because of foreign exchange and a number of other reasons. But it's clear now that regional markets are just as important. And in certain cases and in certain industries, local markets are critically important. So essentially what I'm saying is that all markets matter, and that our orientation and our training to markets have simply not come up to that idea that all markets matter, especially local markets, in large part because in Asia and in Africa and in Latin America, we get this tremendous rise in urbanization. So the urban consumer provides a tremendous opportunity for SMEs, particularly from rural areas in the food industry, from which my background starts from. So I do think that market access is critically important, and that the challenges that we are faced with having SMEs who fundamentally understand this very dynamic and unstable institution called a market, it remains a challenge that we have. Earlier, William spoke about the instability that nowadays global markets are presenting. And I really think that this is a part and feature of what we're trying to do in making SMEs more resilient. But market access, to me, is a key driver to their success.
Iwan, would you like to?
I cannot agree more with what Ralph just mentioned. And earlier, Willie was talking about the global uncertainty and how international trade diversifications can help MSME. The matter of the fact is, we know that the contributions of the MSME products in total export, for example, is very low. In fact, when I look at the data among ASEAN countries, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Indonesia's contribution of MSME in total export is among the lowest. Actually, I think Pak Burhan's slide shows it's about 15%. Even in Cambodia, it's higher and so forth. So one of the challenges here is that if we are really, and I fully agree with what Ralph mentioned about market is not only domestic but also global. If we are really trying push and provide help for global market for MSME. I think serious effort have to be directed towards how to not only opening the market, but there are a lot of other ecosystem that needs to be provided for the MSME, because I have a couple of examples, actual case where MSME has been working very hard to try to find external market, and finally they found it. But then when the importer was asking them to supply a large amount of the commodities, the MSME cannot do that. So that means, yes, you can get the market, but you don't have the capacity to provide that. So I think the key here is the ecosystem. It's not just opening the market, but trying to follow through. And again, I cannot help using the case of what I happen to be done with in China. Once the government said that MSME has to expand the global market, they really have from A to Z, every single step. And that explains, I think, why the MSME products from China has been all over the world. I think the capacity in terms of the human ability to manage and everything, it's not far different between countries. But I think this is the case where the government is really helping, not only opening the market, but every single step, the financing, the technology, and by the way, for the global market, when we talk about finance, one of the most important things is trade financing. And unfortunately, if I look at the global data of trade financing, has been declining over the years. And yet, this trade financing is really key for many of the small business in terms of trying to penetrate the global market.
And I would like to add something about market access. In the past few years, we have been doing a lot of research on, again, I'm more familiar with agricultural SMEs, but we have noticed that there is a revived interest in many countries, many regions, in fostering aggregation models of production. In other words, associations or cooperatives, if you will. Through aggregation models of production, the individual SMEs, they can have more negotiation power, it becomes cost effective to build capacity in the sense of they can hire a fractional CFO, which by the way has become quite popular in Latin America. So it's a very inexpensive way to hire a professional CFO or business advisor, which you only hire part-time. So this concept of fractional CFO is gaining momentum in Latin America. But to make it more cost-effective, we have to think about the possibility of fostering aggregation models of production. And from what we have seen, there are many programs, at least it's a revived interest of cooperativism in Mexico, particularly in Mexico, but also in the rest of Latin America. I just want to put my 2 cents there.
Lintu, could I add something to what you're saying?
Yeah, sure.
So one thing we're finding in Japan is these export promotion agencies seem to be very helpful. So the Japanese companies have a lot of trouble if it's a distant market, but these export promotion agencies help the firms to bridge the gap so they're able to reach these distant markets. So that might be something that would be helpful for Indonesia. Also with what Iwan was saying about how Indonesia seems to have a lower level of exports for SMEs compared to other Asian countries, I think Indonesia is also less involved in global value chains than, say, countries like Vietnam or Thailand or Malaysia. And I think if there could be more linking between, say, MNCs and global value chains in Indonesia, that would help the smaller companies to be able to export more?
I think both Willem and Iwan have talked about, alluded to this idea of an ecosystem for these MSMEs, for trade, for building skills. What about this idea of digitalization, and are MSMEs being left behind? Is it a way to help MSMEs? Leslie, what do you think about this issue?
Thank you, Lynn. Definitely, it's important. And you know, in a study from last year, they found that digitalization improves productivity of SMEs by 30% and profits by 35%. Now, these are big numbers. However, there are many degrees of digitalization, as we all know. If we think about digitalization as information, communication technologies, then cell phones, cellular phone, mobile phones fall into this category. More importantly is that there is we need to understand that there is a concept called digital maturity. So in other words, the ability of a country or an organization to leverage the digital technologies. The level of maturity is small, then there are missing opportunities. And for the case of Latin America, it's estimated that 70% of micro, small, and medium enterprises have low levels of digital maturity. They do, however, have become creative in the sense of using information to play as a backbone to access many other types of technologies. But even without access to cloud computing in their operations, in Latin America it has become extremely common, very common that I'm not saying micro enterprises, one-man shop, for instance, they resort to three technologies: WhatsApp, Facebook, and Instagram. And with those three technologies, they have a virtual store, and they can produce and sell out pretty much anywhere within their region, their country. Many tax regulations.
If I could just chime in just a little bit, I hate to interrupt, but just it's an important point here that Leslie made here is this phase. Kenya would be an example to look at here.
Brought up as a challenge for MSMEs. So what are your thoughts, Ralph, on that statement? That lack of innovation is an issue.
Well, from my experiences of working directly with thousands of small SMEs in Asia and as well as in about 15 different countries in Africa, I find that small businesses are tremendously innovative. What I do, however, find that there's a measurement problem about what is innovation, the concept, and how do we measure it, and what does it really mean? So we think that something is new and to the market, but then you must ask the question, how new is new? And it has been often said that there's nothing new under the sun. Innovation is something that is difficult to measure, and the source of innovation in the economy, I think economists have struggled to really sort of pinpoint what is the source? Does it come from a scientific laboratory? Does innovation come from multinational corporations? Or is it that two guys in the backyard tinkering in their garage can transform something and develop companies through Google or Apple or anything like this? What then is the source of innovation? oftentimes the innovation that is started with SMEs are simply acquired. Larger companies simply acquire them through strategic acquisition. So therefore, who gets credit for the innovation is sometimes masked in terms of the measurement and accounting. So I was just stunned because I walked into this executive training programs with SMEs with the idea of not looking for a lot of innovation, but it's just the opposite. In terms of new products, developing new services, developing new ways of doing things, they are constantly experimenting and developing new ideas that I think that are tremendously innovative.
Lintu, could I add something? I totally agree with everything Ralph is saying. I think one thing we noticed from, say, Korea and Taiwan during the early stages of development is you had these little firms that were very innovative, but there was also a lot of investment in human capital. So I think investing in human capital from the moment a baby's born until they graduate from high school, I think that really helps foster innovation.
That's a very good point, Ramon. So now we've discussed, 6 challenges: the limited managerial skills, lack of innovation, limited access to financing, uneven implementation of government policies, lack of digitalization, and infrastructure and market access. So it seems that these were the 6 that the panelists were asked to kind of think about and share their thoughts on. So I'm curious, do the panelists agree with this list that these are the 6 most important challenges that MSMEs face? Is there one that's most important?
I wanted to say that we have sort of bounced around these 6 challenges, but I do want to acknowledge the beautiful artwork that we see here with the mountains and the rugged trail. Iwan Aziz had been scheming, I think, for some time here, and I think he's quite modest about this, but I've had a series of conversations with him that I had little idea that he was drawing this painting. I think it's on the larger screen from time to time that has shown the various challenges until we get up to global markets. And then that painting, I was so inspired by the artwork and the creativity that it was just simply beautiful. The painting, to me, I think it sort of summarized all of the challenges we're talking about. But then there's a lot, I think, that goes beyond these 6 issues. And putting them in some type of a hierarchy, I think would be a real challenge. I think it depends on whose perspective you look at. If you look at it from the government, if you look at it from the SME, if you look at it from a banker's perspective, I think the weight on these challenges would be a little bit different. That said, I want to end with a small story here. One night, I gathered in a room with over 100 SMEs across 15 African countries. And we had invited a keynote speaker. I'm not going to give you his name because he's fairly well known, but he walked into the room with bodyguards because his life had been threatened from a previous situation that he had gotten himself into. And it was somewhat tense and mysterious, but I noticed just how calm he was. And the first question that was posed to him was, what is the biggest challenges that face small businesses in Africa? And I sat there and I knew for sure he was going to say, finance, or technology, or markets, or infrastructure, or maybe government. I had no idea what he was going to say, but I knew that it had to be one of our 6 items. But it was to my surprise that he said something totally different. And he said the biggest challenges of SMEs is trust. Trusting one another, having customers trust them trusting the markets because the markets was somewhat new and unstable and there was a lack of trust. But for him, it came down to something that was more human. And he spoke of the question of trust. That said, we're not going to talk about trust here today, but if I look at those six, then market access has to be a big one for me.
Well, to follow up with Ralph, wonderful experience there. We don't have time here, but I have a couple of experiences as well. But trust is one of the important components of social capital. Another important component of social capital is network. And this is the reason why many of us is really having this idea to establish a network. Now, let me start giving the national level of relevance of network here. During the COVID, all businesses, big, medium, small, were badly hit during the COVID. But if we look at who recovered fast, unfortunately is the big and to some extent the medium one. Not because they are doing better, not because they are more sort of skillful and so forth. But they have a network. They know who are the bankers. And to some extent, they also know who are the policymakers, who are the regulators. So they can sort of negotiate, they can approach them. But millions of MSME, especially the micro, they don't even know whom to contact. And that's why the key here is to really network. And that's also the conclusions that I get from 2 years to survey in Indonesia. If someone asks, what are really the key challenges of millions of MSME in Indonesia? The answer is network, basically. And we want to expand the whole idea of the social capital, which is network, into a global south. And I think Pak Burhan and Wilhelm already gave the arguments under the current severe uncertainty in global trade and global economy and so forth, diversification. And this is the reasons why I think we believe that the diversification towards global south for an SME becomes very, very important.
Thank you. Any additional thoughts?
Trust so that they can use banks for their operation. On the other hand, IDIC is also concerned with the financial stability so that MSME as the client of the bank can also continue to do business so that their money is safe and things like that. That's one of the reasons why MSME and financial institutions like IDIC are really they are different, but it's inseparable because both of them are really helping to maintain the financial stability. And last but not least is that we know all over the world the MSME we discussed earlier are risky financially, and that's why many banks are rather reluctant to lend enough credits to the MSME and so forth. So if the banking sector under the leadership of IDIC can be made stable and they can extend credits with minimum risk, combining with all the things that we discussed earlier about digitalization, about management skill and so forth, I think growth of the MSME can contribute more significantly compared to what it is now. Because, as I said earlier, contributions of MSME so far in terms of growth is rather small, even though the number of the people involved in MSME are very large.